Morning. Yeah, that was peppy. It was really peppy. I'll bring down the tone a little bit, don't worry. I'm kidding. If y'all have seen my text, you might have that perception already. But if this is your first time here, if this is your 15th year of attending here, we're glad that you're here this morning. I know we have some extra visitors with baby blessing, and we're excited that you're here. My name is Jeff Day, and I'm the student minister here. I work with the teenagers and the families of teenagers primarily, but I've made this joke before with a small church with 5 of us on staff that you do a little bit of everything. So here I am. And Josh is out of town this week, but super excited that you're here this morning. We are going to wrap up our sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount. We have been going through over the past 8 to 9 weeks, on different pieces of the Sermon on the Mount. We've just kind of walked our way through it, and here we are at the end of all things, where I get to kind of sum it all up, and it's going to be fun, I think. But last week, Nick Clifton, who is a member here, preached on the sermon about judgment. Do not judge lest you be judged, all those things. You've heard it before. He revealed to us something very interesting, and I think something that's very telling about our friend Nick Clifton. And he's not in here this morning. He's in the nursery, and I really was hoping that he'd be in here. But he did tell us, he kind of bared his heart a little bit and told us that Moana made him cry. And for those of you who haven't seen Moana, go watch it. It's a great movie. I wasn't close to crying in Moana, but I really enjoyed the movie myself. But I can see how, if you watch the movie Moana and you have 2 little girls at home, I can see how the emotions would come. I can see how that would evoke some type of response and emotion, because there's this strong woman who's doing this amazing thing, and he said that he cried because he wants his girls to grow up strong. And we all have these things that make us cry, right? There's a button that has to be activated for the tear ducts to start releasing things. And for those of you who don't cry on a regular basis, sometimes those cries look longer than other times. And some of you are sitting around in here thinking that I don't cry, and I've never cried before. Well, you will, and when you do, it's going to be rough. Just letting you know. Sometimes it's a TV show or a commercial or a Facebook video. I know that we see things like, I saw something on Twitter a couple of weeks ago about an entire school who celebrated their janitor on his birthday. And if you've seen that video and you don't cry, we can talk after this. If you don't feel something, we can talk after this. It's an extremely emotional moment where this entire school, this elementary school, celebrates their janitor that they know and love, and he comes in and he's just, all weepy and things like that. But maybe it's one of the videos of the soldiers that come home from active duty, and their family members hasn't seen them for a while. And we all know what those videos look like because we've seen them, and they're very special to see a loved one after so long. Or maybe it's just a dog video. Maybe it's a cat video. Maybe it's a rescue story about an animal that has been abused or lived in an abusive situation, and somebody rescues that animal and they learn to love again. And it's just this beautiful experience, because that gets me every single time. If you subscribe to those videos on social media or any type of email or whatever, you know that you're in for it every single time. But for me, personally, the moments that tend to make me get emotional, the things that activate this button that unleashes the tear ducts, usually involves a movie or a television show, some form of art that I take in. And I want to share with you something that that has really, in the past year and a half, I can't even really listen to this song without the tears starting to well up a little bit. So I'm going to play for you a clip, something that's affected me over the past year.
They can say it all sounds crazy. They can say we've lost our minds. I don't care if they call us crazy. Run away to a world that we design. 'Cause every night I lie in bed, the brightest colors fill my head. A million dreams are keeping me awake. I think of what the world could be, a vision of the one I see. A million dreams is all it's gonna take. Oh, a million dreams for the world we're gonna make.
Yes, it's The Greatest Showman. Yes, it's a musical. Yes, it's fantastic. And if you do not like musicals, most of you like music. And if you haven't heard that song before, go listen to the song. It's fantastic. It's not that clip exactly that makes me cry, but it is the song. It's the lyrics. It's the beautiful lyrics that point us in the direction of something different. And the story, if you've seen the movie, it's this boy who grows up in poverty, and in the first 20 minutes of the theater, in this movie, I'm sitting in the theater and I'm watching this movie, and I'm wondering, why is this, the tears are starting to well up a little bit, and I'm wondering, why is this happening to me? Why is this movie evoking so much emotion within me? And it's because these lyrics, you can say that I've gone crazy. You can say I've lost my mind, and I don't care. Call me crazy, but we can live in a world that we design. And I realize that while I'm watching this film, while I'm watching this song is straight gospel. This song encapsulates the life of Jesus, and I'm transported to a place where I see Jesus on the side of a hill, and he's speaking to a whole bunch of people in occupied Israel, occupied by Rome. He's talking to them about a different way to see the world, a different way to live this life. And we've been taught all these many different things, all of these biases, all of these prejudices about how the world works. We've been taught to just see the world in certain ways. And Jesus is sitting on a hill, and he's saying to this crowd and to his people, to his followers, to the people that he's closest to, it can be different. It can be better. But here's the deal. It's going to take dreamers. It's going to take an imagination to see the world in a different way. It's going to take some hard roads. It's going to take some different foundations. It's going to take some new pictures and some new metaphors and some new actions on how we participate in this world. This is the gospel. That there's something different, there's something new, there's something better, and you can be free. And the invitation is always, do you want to be free? Do you want to find this new freedom? And so I realize the things that make me cry the most in all of television shows, media, movies, is because we see the Christ story played out over and over and over again. I've told my teenagers before that I think that Hollywood, I think that anyone who makes any form of media is obsessed with the Christ story. Because to have this story about a different way to live in the world, this different way, this kingdom way to live in the world, it's something that captivates the imagination. It's something that captivates all the dreamers out there. And so Jesus is sitting on the side of the hill and he's calling forth a bunch of different people from all backgrounds, but with one common focus, that we can live in this kingdom world today, now, and here. He's not talking about something that's going to happen in the future after we die. Jesus is talking about what can be done here in this world. This morning, the text is Matthew 7, verses 13 through 28. Enter through the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the road is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. And how narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life. Few will find it. Be on your guard against false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravaging wolves, because you'll recognize them by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree produces good fruit, but the bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, neither can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that doesn't produce the good fruits is cut down and thrown into the fire, so you'll recognize them by their fruit. And not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but the only one who does the will of my Father in heaven. And on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name, drive out demons in your name, and do many miracles in your name? And then I will announce to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers. And therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who builds his house on the rock. The rains fell, the rivers rose, and the winds blew and pounded that house. Yet it didn't collapse, because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rains fell, the rivers rose, and the winds blew and pounded the house, and it collapsed. It collapsed with a great crash. And when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teachings, because he was teaching them like one who had authority, and not like their scribes. The common theme that we've been working towards through this entire sermon series has been this: the Sermon on the Mount is about restorative justice in the world. Obviously, something has gone wrong, something is amiss, and there has got to be some type of justice that fixes everything. And so Jesus recognizes that we've got to counteract, we've got to teach a different narrative, we've got to retrain our brains in understanding how the world works. This restorative justice will require new imagination and new ways to see the world and people. And I know how we have typically read these passages before. By the way, side note, I get all three of those in my sermon series. Like, I have all three of the things that we could preach on those for weeks. But at the same time, we tend to read those passages so negatively. This whole time, Jesus has flipped the crowd's perspective. He has, well, let's be frank, he's probably enraged them at some points. with these new words. He's probably inspired them. He's probably motivated them. He has encouraged them. And most of all, let's be honest, he's probably just enraged them. And we read this passage as a warning. We read it as a classic hellfire and brimstone preacher would that warns anyone and everyone everywhere that if you don't follow the rules or stay in line, then you are liable to end up walking down the path of destruction, or ending up in the fire with the bad trees, or being swept away with the floods in the desert. Because unless you walk this tightrope, you are going to burn, and you are going to burn good. We have been taught so many things about worrying about our future existence somewhere else that we have forgotten the restorative justice that Jesus is trying to bring about here and now. This sermon is not about something that's going to happen later on. It's something about, it's happening right now. Jesus doesn't have some future paradise or future fiery chasm in mind. He's talking about the paradise that you bring around yourself right here and right now and for others, or a fiery chasm that you bring around yourself and others here and now. This sermon has been building off of each piece, off of one another, brick by brick, stone by stone, step by step, and it's crescendoing into this final moment. This grand finale, this moment when, if you can imagine, Jesus doesn't tell us all of this and then stand on a rock and say, and finally, you're up a creek. It's not going to work. And you're going to die. And you're going to fail all the time. Jesus isn't ending this sermon where he just 5 paragraphs earlier talks about fear and anxiety and about trusting in God, and then 5 paragraphs later tell us things that cause fear and anxiety. I know Josh preached on that 2 or 3 weeks ago, but this happened like 5 minutes ago. This was 5 paragraphs earlier that he's talking about fear and anxiety, and he's not trying to do the reverse. He's not trying to undo what he has done. We tend to look at the negative side of these metaphors and we focus on the wolves in sheep clothing, or the wide road that leads to destruction, or the builder that gets his house blown away by the flood, and it absolutely terrifies us. We have used this as a fear tactic for far too long. Jesus is relying for this entire sermon on a keen understanding of the human heart. Throughout this entire sermon, he is building to this very moment when he's going to teach us about life, about goodness, about a different way. Jesus didn't start out this sermon for this purpose, because we know in our hearts, we know within our souls what playing the comparison game eventually leads us to, right? Going back to the first part of the Sermon on the Mount, we know what happens when we agonize over this maddening game of who is blessed and who is cursed. Does God actually like me? Or does God actually hate me? We know what happens when hatred and fear in the mind and the soul, when that takes hold in the mind and the soul. We know what happens when that takes place. We know what happens when living a life dominated by excess and hoarding our possessions transforms us into. And we know what the state of fear and anxiety eventually takes from us. We know what happens when judgment creeps into our consciousness and controls our every thought. And all this being said, we know exactly what the path of destruction looks like. We know exactly what the path of destruction looks like because we've all walked it before. In fact, many of us are walking it now. In my own life, I regularly walk the path of destruction. I know the things that don't lead towards life. In fact, I know the path of destruction so well. I know the trees along the way. I know how the road feels. I know the people that I pass on it. In fact, I know them well. I know what it smells like. I know what it looks like. We know what happens when a good tree produces good fruit, but we also know what happens when a bad tree produces bad fruit. We know with good intentions when we build our houses on things that cannot withstand storms. All of these metaphors ring true to the deepest parts of our humanity and human experience because we know what happens when this sermon is not lived out. Because we look like wolves. We look like wolves in sheep's clothing. And we become trees that produce bad fruit. And we become extremely foolish builders. And the funny thing is, we take this final crescendo and we forget the last passage that we just talked about, that Nick talked us through last week. We forget the passage about the plank sticking out of our head, and we look for the sawdust in someone else's eye, and we are looking around for all those who might lead us down the wrong path or who might produce bad fruit, and it's part of the sermon that has us looking at everyone else instead of within. But this sermon has always and forever been about what type of restorative justice will you allow Jesus to transform within you so that you can in turn join in the restorative justice that Christ is doing in the world. I'm going to say that again. This sermon has always and forever been about what type of restorative justice will you allow Jesus to transform and work within you so that you can join in the restorative justice that Christ is doing in the world. This finale is about recognizing that we all innately understand what these paths of destruction look like, and there is a better way. There's a better way, and it's built for dreamers. You're going to have some imagination when it comes to this way. And it's called the kingdom. Do you want to put to rest the trouble in your heart that God either hates you or loves you? The dreamer says this: start seeing everyone as blessed, and you'll have your answer. Do you feel meaningless with no calling? The dreamer says you have identity, you have vocation, and it is love. You are salt and you are light, so build a heavenly culture. Do you have an endless hatred in your heart for an individual or a group of people? The dreamer does not repay evil with evil, but they pray for them, because in doing so, they will know them. And you will cease to hate them. Do you have an incessant need for excess and items that you believe will make you happy? The dreamer invests their time in people. They allow themselves to love and to be loved. For this is what God does. And in doing so, you will begin to form a generous heart. Do you suffer from crippling fear and anxiety? Do you suffer from the fear of not being in control? The dreamer leans on brothers and sisters around them. They ask for help, and they accept help. And they learn to trust God by trusting in the people of God? And do you struggle with the constant judgment of people? Are you unable to see the image of God in another? The dreamer looks at their own shortcomings. They look at the paths of destruction that they regularly take, and they get to know those that walk down the same roads. All of these things strike so closely to our humanity, and I would dare say we don't need Scripture to understand the paths of destruction. We don't need to understand what the paths of destruction look like because we know them well. We've experienced them. We've walked down them with others. Jesus is only speaking to the absolute truth of the human experience. Jesus is telling these people on the side of the hill what they have known to be true since the dawn of time. Right now, I would ask that our deacons and elders stand up. Deacons, elders, they are. What we're going to do today is we are going to end with an invitation, whatever that looks like. If you are struggling to see hope, if you are struggling to see goodness, if you are struggling with any of these teachings that prevent you from seeing a new way to live in the world, these people in this room, they're ready to talk to you, to receive you, to love you, to pray with you. So I would ask that our elders and our deacons please move to the sides and to the back. The end of this sermon has always been an invitation. In fact, this entire sermon has always been an invitation. Can you dream with me about something different? Can you dream with me about a new way to see the world? There is a better way, and you can be free. And you can take the narrow road. It's not as wide or as well worn, but you can be free. You can take a tree that produces good fruit. You can be a tree that produces good fruit. It will take some time and it won't pay off immediately, but you can be free. And you can build your house to last. It's more difficult and it requires more effort, but you can be free. Go ahead and invite the band up. And so this grand invitation for dreamers, for people willing to see the world in a different way. Do you want to be free? Are you willing to dream about a world that Jesus sees for all of humanity and that can be lived out every single day? Are you audacious and scandalous enough to dream about it? I want to pray for us, and we'll have our final song. God, you are good. And we acknowledge that above all things. That this new way that we see the world through the eyes of the Sermon on the Mount is something that will transform us, something that will work in us and make us not only the best form of ourselves, but the best form for other people. Thank you for what you are doing in us every single day. Thank you for the conviction, the inspiration, the hope, that comes with this new way to see the world. God, we ask in the moments where we cannot dream or be inspired or have an imagination because of pain, because of hurt, because of hopelessness. God, we look to you for those times. That you would make us dreamers and imaginers for something better. In all things we give you praise because you are good, because you love us.